one thing I might wonder, looking at my table, is why isn't SQL Server using my non-clustered column store index? On every execution plan we've looked at for this query, I haven't seen my non-clustered column store index in there, and there is one on ag.firstnamebyyear statewide. Well, whenever I'm wondering why SQL Server isn't using an index, if I have the ability to test, an interesting thing to do is to use an index hint to force it to use the index in my test. Looking at the execution plan, I may see something that points out to me exactly why it wasn't making that choice, so it can be very, very interesting. I'm using my table variable test here, and this step where it puts the data into the table variable, that's the one that takes so long. So I'm saying, when you're calculating the rank, use the column store index on that part of the query. I haven't applied any hints to the second part of the query that joins back to it. So giving it a run, let's see how it performs, but also what looks different in our execution plan that might explain the choices it's been making. Our runtime isn't too fantastic. We're over 7 seconds of duration and CPU time. Looking at the plan, it did use my column store index, but then it pushed everything out into a sort operator. Let's take more of a look at this column store index scan. Looking at the properties, sure enough, we were in batch mode, which is a super fast, cool mode it can use. But there's something interesting that's missing from this look at our column store index scan. I am running Developer Edition, which has the same features as Enterprise Edition. And column store indexes in Enterprise Edition have this really cool aggregate predicate pushdown feature where it can actually take a bunch of the work of like grouping and aggregating and push it down into the column store index scan itself. And I don't have any indication that that happened here. Looking at my sort operator and scrolling down, I can expand on the order by and look at and see that the columns that it was sorting by were report year, state code, gender, and name count descending. It's doing all of this sorting in memory. So it's really just able, in this case, to use the column store index for data retrieval. And then it's having to do a big sort and then push data into a window aggregate and then that filter. So it wasn't able to actually use any of the magic from the column store, and it had to resort everything as an independent operator. Well, this makes me realize I have seen that magic happen in column store before when I was doing group by queries. I'm looking at ranks of number 1 based on name count descending. Maybe if I rewrite my query with a group by and a max operator, I can get that column store index magic to happen. So what I've got in this query rewrite is I'm grouping by report year, state code, and gender. And then for that, I'm finding the max name count. I have this as a subquery, and I'm saying name this max count. Join back to ag.firstnamebyyear wide on the report year, state code, and gender for the row where the name count equals my max name count. I'm grabbing all those reporting columns still. I'm still joining to ref.firstname. It's just instead of using a windowing function, I'm using a rewrite that uses max name count. Executing my query, wow, the data is back already. And I have an elapsed time of just 685 milliseconds. Looking at my execution plan, I don't have any warnings at all. I've got a lot of nested loop joins, and I have a column store index scan. I didn't even hint that this time. It just naturally went for it. Looking at the properties on my column store index scan, I can see that this time, yep, I've got batch mode. This time I do have information for the actual number of locally aggregated rows on my column store index scan. It was able to push some of that grouping hard work down into the column store index itself. It fed everything out of that column store index scan into a hash match aggregate. And I can see on my hash match aggregate, looking at my hash keys build, that it did have to do some work in aggregating here. But some of that was also handled in the column store index. Looking at the number of rows that it was estimating in different places, I can see that it had a really good idea with this query syntax of how many rows it was going to have to deal with, and that it made those decisions to make the nested loop joins with pretty good estimates. I mean, incredibly accurate estimates in this case of how many rows it was going to deal with. So it had better insight using the current version of the cardinality estimator with a different syntax here. Well, maybe I just have this non-clustered column store index here on my test instance. Maybe that index isn't in production yet. What if I want to know, how does my rewrite perform without that? Do I have to drop the non-clustered column store? I do not. There is a query hint I can use to say, just ignore any non-clustered column store index that you find on this table. And I'm going to go ahead and run the query and say, how do you do if you use the new syntax, which uses group by and max, but no column store? Well, in this case, I get a runtime of just over 2 seconds. Better than I've gotten with any other hint so far, except for when I was using that non-clustered column store. And looking at my execution plan, it's quite similar to the one that used column store, except I have an index scan of a non-clustered row store index feeding into a stream aggregate operator. But even without that non-clustered column store, SQL Server is able to have a better execution plan for this case with a group by and a max. Now, I'm not saying that windowing functions are bad. Not at all. Windowing functions are great, and you can do some really cool things with them. In this case, I have a different syntax that gives me faster performance, and the idea to use that syntax came, in my case, from using an index hint saying, hey, why doesn't the column store index work well with my current windowing function? But sometimes windowing functions will still be the right choice. I don't want to turn you completely off windowing functions. It's just that in my case, they didn't get the best performance.